This conversation looks at who are the major actors in the international system that our theories are going to engage with, and we're going to try to explain the behavior of and end up being important in terms of our story about how the international system operates. And I think most theories of international politics would put states at the center of that story. And so when we say states, we don't mean states in the sort of U.S. sense, but instead as in countries. Sometimes we use nations interchangeably, but that has a slightly different meaning. When political scientists talk about states, they typically are talking about territorial entities, so they're territorial political entities that are controlled by sovereign governments. And so we can break those components down. Territorial means I can find it on a map. There are distinct and clear borders that are claimed by the state. Political entities means that there is a government and that government is sovereign. And sovereignty is actually a really important concept in terms of international politics. It's the principle that a state is answerable to no higher authority and can do what it likes, which is maybe not actually the right way to frame that. A state can govern its domestic affairs as it sees fit. So it can set its own tax rates. It can determine its own rules in terms of speed limits, or set up its own welfare state, or make determinations about how it selects its leadership, that domestically states are able to do these things without asking permission from any larger entity beyond their borders. And this current system today comprises about 194-ish sovereign states. And I say ish here because, well, one, we add additional states every once in a while as independence movements or as partition movements sort of break territories apart, but also because that question of sovereignty can be messy, it can be murky. And so if I was going to point to Taiwan, I would say, well, Taiwan definitely can be found on a map. There's clear, territorial borders. There's a government that essentially rules over Taiwan. And I think for all practical purposes, that government is sovereign. It sets its tax rates, it sets its speed limits, it chooses, what it uses for electrical current for its outlets. It's governing itself without reference to anybody else. But other states in the international system, particularly China, don't recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan and actually claim authority over Taiwan, which ends up sort of placing it in sort of an international gray area. So sovereignty isn't just sort of a de facto thing. There's also sort of the recognition of sovereignty by other states that ends up being important. And without that recognition of sovereignty, it's hard to know if a state is going to, over the long term, be able to maintain that identity and maintain that position as a sovereign state in the international system. Another example of a territorial entity that exists in kind of this gray area is the Palestinian Authority, which has territory. You can find it on a map in terms of controlling portions of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. There is a government, there is a Palestinian Authority, but I don't know that there's consensus that entity is sovereign rather than something that was set up in conjunction with a agreement from and with Israel over the governance of occupied territories. So it's in sort of this gray area, but by and large, the vast majority of the planet is carved up into sovereign states that cover basically every square inch of land, and we have more or less agreement over what that sovereignty looks like in terms of claims over territory, which is actually kind of a new development because historically states were pretty rare. This is a map I stole out of an anthropology textbook that kind of tries to think about what political governance looked like 500 plus years ago. And there were states, there were territorial entities with governments that ruled over themselves and directed their populations, but they didn't comprise the whole planet. They comprised a portion of the planet, and they weren't always connected to each other, right? So there were state systems, there were pockets of states that maybe didn't interact with other states because they were separated by geographic distance, while other portions of the world, sort of the greenish areas in North America and South America, Australia, and sort of Asia, were governed through bands, which might be sort of hunter-gatherer bands of maybe 20 to 150 people that sort of self-directed themselves and self-governed themselves, not through any sort of hierarchy, but through interacting as a group and sort of working out problems internally. Maybe they were small independent villages that again sort of governed themselves internally but weren't part of any sort of larger structure. Or maybe people were organized as chiefdoms. These are the purplish areas on the map where there were sort of networks of these independent villages, and in times of crisis, maybe they'd come together and there'd be sort of a informal hierarchy about which villages or which leaders should sort of take on an important role in terms of solving those problems. It was a very loose form of governance that didn't necessarily look like a state. So the development of the international system to be one in which we have essentially the entire planet covered by states is a fairly new development, and one that we're going to talk about sort of where that came from and how that emerged. States aren't the only actors in the international system. There are also a host of non-state actors. We could talk about intergovernmental organizations, IGOs. I realize the G should be capitalized there, but that's not how it's spelled, but that's how acronyms work. IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, which helps us differentiate between non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and then multinational corporations. So when we're thinking about intergovernmental organizations, we're thinking about organizations whose membership is made up of states. These are created by states. You have to be a state to participate, and there's about 5,000 of these things. Things like the United Nations, which is, again, created by states through an agreement that they negotiated, and in order to be a member of the United Nations, you need to be a state. And these international organizations, these IGOs, can be global, like the United Nations. They can be regional, like the European Union or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, or they can be very, very localized, right? They can be built around a specific problem, right? There could be an intergovernmental organization that's designed to sort of manage the flow of a river that crosses international borders and can contain, 2 or 3 states that solve this very specific kind of problem. But intergovernmental organizations tend to be forums where states come together to facilitate cooperation and work together. We also have non-governmental organizations. These are organizations that are operating out in the international system, but who are made up not by states, but by people. They're sort of non-profits. Individuals sort of come together and provide resources and membership and create these entities that go out and do things. And they do lots of things. They're involved in development work and education and health. They're involved in advocating policy around the environment, or around denuclearization, or getting rid of landmines. So there's lots of NGO activity out there in the international system. NGOs that sort of register with the United Nations and are sort of formally recognized, there tends to be about 25,000 of those, but there are also many NGOs that are operating without sort of that formal recognition, but are still out there doing things. And then we have multinational corporations. These are just simply businesses or companies that are based in one country but operate in another country. Sometimes it's just, I have a subsidiary in Canada and therefore I'm a multinational corporation, but other multinational corporations are completely global organizations that have massive budgets annually that are comparable to what states have, or who have employees and workforces globally that are, again, comparable to the population of entire countries. So multinational corporations can be very powerful, important actors in the international system. Again, trying to put a number on it, we're looking at about 60,000 or more multinational corporations that are active out in the international system. But then there's also other actors that I've struggled with how to describe these other actors because they're sort of like NGOs, and that they're centered around people who are doing things that have sort of international implications. But NGOs, particularly because they register with the United Nations, often are created for ideally some sort of positive purpose. And there are entities out there that are structured like NGOs, but whose purpose is maybe more malicious. And so I've decided to just sort of label these as dark networks, dark in that they are trying to avoid sort of a public presence because they're engaged in something that largely the international system is trying to suppress. So we can think about criminal gangs or cartels as part of these dark networks, right? They're engaged in a criminal activity, they're operating across borders, they're made up of people, but by and large states are trying to stomp them out, and so they operate sort of covertly. Hacker groups might be another example of this, where you have hacker groups that get involved in all sorts of conflicts, whether it's releasing classified documents like WikiLeaks has done to try to embarrass the United States or to influence elections. Or we could have groups like Anonymous that have gotten involved in targeting Russia after their invasion of Ukraine. So there's lots of examples of these sort of independent entities that are maybe engaged in criminal or quasi-criminal activities, and then in some cases engaged in out-and-out sort of war fighting or militant type activities. So terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda or ISIS are also out there doing things in the international system. They're made up of people. They're operating across borders. They're trying to affect policy, but they're doing it in a way that largely runs into conflict with other actors in the international system. I think a lot of these things we point to and we think maybe these are new phenomenon. They're not actually new phenomenon. There have been transnational criminal and militant organizations for hundreds of years. But what we have seen is, or what we think we've seen, is that technology like the internet and mass communication and easy transportation and globalization more generally have perhaps made these actors more able or better able to influence international politics, and maybe they are a more important part of the international system now because those technologies have empowered them to recruit globally, to promote their message globally, and to influence international politics in a wide variety of ways, both online and in real life.